Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Charlie Peters. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Just last night, members of parliament in the UK voted 364 to 111 against a Tory measure to establish an inquiry into grooming gangs. Here's more on what happened from Yahoo News. Quote, Tory leader Kemi Badenoch put down an amendment to the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill on Wednesday, demanding one be established. It called for ministers, quote, to develop new legislative proposals for children's well-being, including establishing a national statutory inquiry into historical child sexual exploitation focused on grooming gangs. The report continues to say, however, it was defeated by 364 to 111. Badenoch claimed ahead of the vote that the Prime Minister's refusal to support a national inquiry would fuel concerns about a cover-up. But Starmer accused Badenoch of lies and misinformation and slinging of mud, saying the Wrecking Amendment would not do anything to help victims of child sexual abuse. Okay, Labour MPs, this report in Yahoo News continues, didn't support the amendment because if it had passed, it would have derailed the implementation of the bill, that's according to them, which the government says contains key child protection legislation. So that's a mouthful. It's a rundown of what happened just last night. And I've heard the question from several people here in America in recent days, could this UK grooming scandal possibly be real? That brutality at that scale. And if it's real, how could the cover-up also be real? How could so many people be complicit in so awful a tragedy? Now, no reporter is in a better position to shed light on this than Charlie Peters of GB News, who basically got into journalism to cover this scandal. His recent exclusive on a letter about the ongoing cover-up lit a match that exploded into the recent tsunami of media coverage and political focus. When Charlie outlined the scope of his reporting in an X post on January 1st, Elon Musk reposted that with the comment, quote, "What a travesty." We're lucky to grab a few moments of Charlie's time while he's on the ground in Rotherham, the heart of the scandal, to understand what's happening right now, what's happened over the years, and why it all happened. So Charlie, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Now, before we get to today's vote, you're actually joining us from Rotherham, and I want to ask just the dumb American question, because I've heard a lot of people ask it actually over the last few days. What is the grooming gang scandal, and why are we talking about it right now in 2025?
For the last 50 years, gangs of predominantly Pakistani heritage men have abused underage white working class girls across the United Kingdom, but mostly in former northern mill towns and other towns in the Midlands of England. Reports of this were first made in the 1970s in the local press, but this didn't really reveal itself as a national scandal until the mid-2000s, when a Labour MP called Anne Cryer in the West Yorkshire constituency of Keighley said that there was a problem with Pakistani men abusing white girls. She was roundly criticised for saying this. So the first of many cover-ups occurred, but years later, a journalist at the Times called Andrew Norfolk looked into reports he heard, court records in Rotherham, where I am now, in South Yorkshire, and he found a disturbing pattern, the same pattern that I described right at the top. Predominantly Pakistani men, predominantly white working class girls. And he also found worrying signs of a cover-up, of collusions between the police and the perpetrators, of council workers looking the other way and not properly investigating this issue, in part due to them being chilled by concerns about racism. Now, Andrew Norfolk's reporting led to an independent inquiry in Rotherham that revealed in 2014 that at least 1,400 children had been abused in this town from 97 to 2013. This is a small town, by the way. It's just up the road from Sheffield, a much bigger city in Britain's industrial heartlands. But then further reporting occurred. We learned that in Telford in 2018, at least 1,000 victims had been abused over decades. Local reports in Rochdale and Oldham, towns in Greater Manchester, also have revealed major problems, again, with predominantly Pakistani gangs, predominantly white working class girls. I've been investigating this issue for many years, And it's always been my intent to sort of join the dots on a national level to show that this issue isn't just isolated to a few northern towns. This goes all the way from Bristol, Buckingham, Aylesbury, Banbury, Oxford, and up to Glasgow in Scotland via Newcastle, the northwest, the northeast, and all the rest of it. I've shown through my reporting that despite people feeling as though this is just an issue in a few 6 or so towns in the Midlands and the north, this is a nationwide crisis. And the reason why we're talking about it again is because GB News revealed last week that a government minister called Jess Phillips, who's in charge of safeguarding of women and girls, she had rejected a request led by the council, the local council, the local authority in Oldham for a government-led review. A government-led review that was requested by the survivors of that town. We revealed not only that they disagreed with that request and they denied it, but they took 4 months to respond to that request, leading to many to feel as though grooming gang survivors were still being neglected by political leadership in this country, which has sparked this national conversation, has made people come to realise that maybe we've never properly reckoned with this crisis, that we've had these 50 different towns that we've uncovered. There have been local reports or convictions or prosecutions or serious police investigations, but there's not been that level of independent inquiry that we've seen in just a handful of locations. That sparked all that interest, all that debate, and also some political action.
It seems to me, as an observer in the United States, this appears to be the level of attention that's now going to the issue. This appears to be maybe second only to 2014. Is it your opinion, as it is of many people here in the United States, that this is now being talked about at the volume that it's being talked about because Elon Musk waded into the conversation and sort of blew it up on X and then drove the media cycle? Or do you think actually if Elon Musk had never said a word about this latest development that put it back into the spotlight, we would be having a conversation at the same level?
There's no way we'd be having this conversation without Elon Musk's involvement. I mean, put it this way, Emily. I mean, I've released quite a few exclusives and scoops, and I've scalped a few politicians over the years on this issue. And I thought that my story on Oldham wasn't actually that big in the grand scheme of the reporting I've done in recent years. Do you know what I mean? I've not said this before, but I actually was sitting on that story for 5 weeks before I published it last Wednesday. I've known for ages that Jess Phillips rejected that inquiry. The reason I didn't publish it until last week is because I didn't think it was a very Christmassy story. I didn't want to put it on television towards the end of December. I didn't think it was the right timing. I didn't think it would get enough attention. Little did I know that if I was to wait until the new year, it would attract the attention of the man who owns the platform where I post most of my work. But yeah, I mean, and also another reason why I was happy to sit on the story and delay is because I knew that nobody else was looking into it in that area. So there was no competition for that coverage. And there's no greater feeling for a journalist to know that you're guaranteed exclusives. But at the same time, I'm really quite desperate for some competition here. So Elon Musk sharing it, there's no doubt in my mind, brought that immediately to the forefront of our political attention because about 12 hours after I shared my story from Oldham, the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, she called for a public national inquiry, which they've just voted on in the last couple of hours.
And tell us about that. You're in Rotherham. This vote just happened in Parliament. And I want to ask you about the mood of the town now that it's first week of January 2025, but also just if you could tell us what was just voted down, because there are competing perspectives. Obviously, if you talk to Labour and Conservatives about what actually happened, fill us in, Charlie.
So the government was putting forward a new children's wellbeing bill today, and as part of parliamentary procedure in Britain, opposition parties can vote for amendments and call for amendments to be added to bills. So they lodged an amendment on Monday to add in an additional part of the bill that would require a national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. The Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, he approved the motion, so it had to be voted on, but the government said that any attempt to pass this would actually wreck their plans in the children's bill. It was a wrecking amendment, they said, but the Conservatives said that you couldn't have a focus on children's well-being if we didn't finally investigate this national crisis. Now, only 111 MPs voted for this nationwide grooming gangs investigation. 364 voted against it. Now, the Labour government have said, since we released our story last week and that call for an inquiry came out, they've consistently said that we don't need a national public inquiry because we had the independent inquiry to child sexual abuse published in 2022. That was led by Baroness Alexis Jay, a senior social worker. She also led the inquiry into Rotherham in 2014. But as we've shown in our reporting over many years, that ICSA inquiry, as it's called, only looked at just a handful of areas in the country. It looked at just 6 areas. And the grooming element, the on-street group localised child sexual exploitation element, was a subsection of a wider report. In 400 pages, they mentioned Rotherham once. In 400 pages, they mentioned Rochdale once, and not even in relation to grooming gangs. Telford, that town where I said over 1,000 children were found to be survivors of this appalling abuse, 0 mentions. How is that, in any stretch of the imagination, a proper independent inquiry into grooming gangs? It just isn't. I don't think the government's defence on that works even slightly. However, they also said that report made a series of recommendations. The government now, on Monday, they made an emergency announcement to say they were going to action some of those recommendations, including mandatory reporting. So it's now an offence if you don't report child abuse and you're aware of it in institutional settings. There's going to be stronger prison sentences, an aggravating factor for grooming as part of child sexual offences. That's obviously very welcome, but they've only done that because we've put pressure on them. And also they've started a victim and survivors panel to assess information about child abuse in the future. Fundamentally, the Conservative opposition, and indeed a lot of commentators and campaigners in this space, have said you can't properly respond to that problem of on-street, group localised CSE and abuse until you look into every town and city where there are credible reports of this, because a big part of this story, right from the very start, has been cover-ups. Politicians, police officers, local council officers either looking the other way or actively colluding to prevent this information from being released. So we just don't know how big this scandal is. We don't know just how deep the rot goes. We've never had proper investigations into Bradford, where this is a major issue, into Banbury, where a Somali gang caused unbelievable damage for so long. We've never had a proper investigation into Birmingham, where that safeguarding minister Jess Phillips is from, where I know several survivors who are quite distressed about what's happened tonight with that rejection of a national public inquiry. So lots of debate going on. And frankly, it's long overdue. Obviously, this has been an issue for decades, but it does finally feel now, Emily, that people have turned a page on this debate. They're now seeing this for the national crisis that it is, and they're finally reckoning with the fact that more action and more investigation is really urgently needed.
Well, and so that's where, again, like from an American perspective, Labor's vote here, just politically, I'm confounded by the strategy. And I was hoping, Charlie, that you could shed a little bit of light on that, because we're, more than a decade after what happened in 2014 was revealed, and Keir Starmer flailing politically right now. So to take a vote so resoundingly against the conservative measure here, I mean, on a political level, it seems like something in the U.S. we would say, this is bipartisan. This is, we could all come together and take these votes. Sure. So why not with Labour right now?
I think there's a realistic possibility that a significant portion of the motivation for not looking into this from the Labour government is that many of these areas are in Labour-run councils, and that one of the major inquiries we've had is called the Casey report. Dame Louise Casey looked into Rotherham Council itself in 2015. She found that Labour politicians were covering up this abuse. I think this Labour government fears that if there's a proper, thorough, aggressive, rifle-shot investigation into every area where this has happened, that more appalling headlines for the Labour Party would come out, that we'd learn about more instances of cover-ups, of collusion, of corruption, of people failing to investigate. I think that's almost certainly going to be revealed if there's proper investigation into this issue. So that's possibly the first more cynical and quite, deeply disturbing reason for turning it down. Secondly, because they don't need to do it according to their argument. We've already had that independent inquiry. They say they think it's time for action now, not more words. But again, I go back to what survivors and campaigners have told me this week. You can't have action without investigation. Knowledge gives strength to the arm.
Right, so it's as though they would rather take the L on this vote, take any hit in public opinion, because they know that it'll be less than potentially whatever would come out. So, how is public opinion being shaped on this issue over the last couple of weeks? We're very lucky to get the slice of your time right now because you've just been covering all of this as it's happened. You've had the opportunity to speak with some survivors, I know, but their voices seem to be getting amplified right now, whether it's because of X, because GB News, because X is allowing GB News to have a big voice, because of potentially then more new media gets onto the story, because Reform has Nigel Farage right now and all of that. So the story seems to be benefiting from new media attention and all of that. But how is that affecting the way the public sees the story right now? Are the survivors getting more play with members of the public who are hearing their voices, and that's really damaging labor?
I'm concerned by the extent to which establishment media on this topic is engaging more in political tittle tattle and focusing on Elon Musk rather than the survivors and their demand. For example, I think the BBC were in Oldham on Monday. Their UK editor did an amazing report from Oldham, speaking to people in the town. They didn't speak to any survivors, potentially because they've not worked there for a while. They haven't had those relationships. We had an exclusive report from Oldham yesterday of a survivor there who we revealed after many months of investigating this piece. She was forced to have the contraceptive pill put into her mouth by a male police officer after she was gang raped aged 12. So those are the stories that should be leading this conversation now. Survivors fighting for justice, revealing the crisis that they've been enduring and how they've been denied at every turn. But instead, the topic of conversation from a lot of media houses is, what does this mean for Britain's relationship with the United States? Elon Musk is coming into power with Donald Trump later this month. Isn't that exciting? I even saw one political editor on a flagship news program earlier this week saying this could affect the Five Eyes relationship, the security relationship between the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. What on earth are you talking about? I mean, first and foremost, that's just clearly hyperbole. But why would you even say that? For goodness sake, make sure your political coverage is about the survivors and the implications there. So I've seen, by a factor of 1 million to 1, more conversation about Elon Musk than I think are possibly the most key detail from our exclusive last week about the Oldham report being denied. We revealed that Jess Phillips took 4 months to respond to the survivors, and that also she hasn't met a single one of them. Where are the questions to the Labour ministers and MPs? And by the way, Jess Phillips has not sat down for an interview with GB News. Where are the questions to those people asking them why the government took 4 months to bring forward that response? Instead, the questioning, unfortunately, is more about, oh, what does this tech billionaire mean for Britain? Well, what does the rape gang mean for Britain? What does the cover-up mean for Britain? Can we start there, please, folks?
Now, you've had the opportunity to speak with survivors since the vote. Can you tell us a little bit of what you've heard from them, Charlie?
I don't want to, I'm very sparing when I get in touch with them sort of over the years because I don't want to pester them for questions. The worst thing a journalist wants to do for someone who's endured something horrible is to ask for a quote. Didn't have to bother with that this time because they all came to us straight away with quite a lot of rage. Yeah, just a lot. I mean, I've posted some of it on X this evening, just as it was coming through over the hour since the vote. A lot of hopelessness, helplessness, a lot of anger. A lot of people genuinely didn't believe it would be voted down so aggressively. And I mean, I had to say, I was with the father of a survivor this morning in Rotherham. This man, we know him as Jack. It's not his real name, obviously. He was arrested twice by the police when he tried to save his daughter from a rape den some 20 years ago. He's still fighting for justice. He told me this morning, they're going to vote it down, mate. Don't worry about that. Just, and don't lose heart because I've had loads of setbacks. You've only had a few when you've been, covering this issue. So just like, it's going to happen. We go again tomorrow sort of thing. That's been quite inspiring to hear that sort of line coming from so many survivors, campaigners and their families. Unfortunately, though, a lot of people, I think, are going to shut the world away now, as is their right. They've had, I think, we throw around the word triggering quite a lot. For a lot of these people, this is very difficult to have this national conversation. To have this issue in the spotlight is stressful. Most journalists love it when their story rumbles on for 7 or 8 days. Every morning I've woken up with this story, getting up before the crack of dawn to start covering it on GB News Live at 6 a.m., nervous about how all the people I speak to are feeling because they've got another day of people talking about what happened to them. And let's not beat around the bush here. Let's be direct about what happened to them. These girls endured rape torture gangs. Okay, some of these girls were anally gang raped. They had the initials of their abusers branded with hot spikes on their flesh. Some of these survivors, okay, were kept in dog pens and told to bark like dogs. Some of them were murdered, doused in petrol. They had to endure fake executions, real executions, their homes set ablaze, their throats slit. This is horrendous on another level. The barbarity of it, okay, once you learn about it, once you hear it, once you see it, once you read it, once you sit in court and hear it, it changes you forever. You can't possibly shy away from it after that. So they're reliving that every day, Emily. They're thinking about that every day. That is horrendous. It's horrendous. And yet, that's the sort of pressure they have to endure to push forward and demand not only the attention this story needs, but also the action that it so desperately requires.
How does barbarity at this scale happen in a ostensibly first world country for so long?
Well, yeah, you bring in a third world culture. That'll do it. The people that are perpetrating this abuse don't have respect for women and girls of a standard that you'd anticipate in quaint English, former industrial Victorian parts of England, but also, as you've shown, in Oxford, the city of spires, in Banbury, very close by, in Bristol, by any virtue, quite a well-off city in quite a lot of parts. How does it happen? Well, the grooming model of exploitation normalizes abuse. Girls think that their perpetrators and their abusers are their boyfriends because they're children. They don't know any better. They don't know what consent is. They don't know what a boyfriend is, and they're plied with drugs and alcohol. The gifts often start as sweets and cigarettes, and then from there the abuse turns very aggressively once they're lured in, and once that's set in, once it's normalised, it's very hard to break free, especially if it's happening to everyone around you. One survivor I've known for so many years, Elizabeth, she told me that she never thought that what was happening to her was wrong because it was happening to her friends also. It was happening to them all the time. I was at a court case in September. 6 men were sentenced to 106 years. Not enough, I think, in the views of some. And that survivor, that complainant, as the criminal justice system would put her, she was groomed outside of her school playground at the age of 11. Who can escape that sort of assault if you're 11? You have no avenue to avoid that abuse. How did the cover-up happen? People underestimate the extent of which the power of political correctness can have a hold over a mind and a psyche. The fear of being ostracized in a town where a very small local community thrives on those tight-knit bonds of solidarity within communities. If you feel as though you're going to be the person who breaks that and says the great unsayable and thinks the great unthinkable, no one wants to be ostracized and outcast. And as soon as you see what happens to some people who do that, and you see what happened to Anne Cryer in Keighley, as you mentioned at the start, in 2002, well, why on earth would you risk it? The real shocker here, actually, is how many good people were in part of the cover-up. That's the really horrendous thing, is that otherwise good people can get caught into this hell because speaking out is a cause of corruption coming after you as well. So there are lots of investigations that still need to be done. And also, I guess that's half an answer, because the other half of the answer is I don't know how the cover-up happened because I've only read a handful of reports because that's all there's available. I haven't got an independent investigation into Bradford, so I don't know what happened there. But the MP there, Robbie Moore, he tells me that if it were to be launched, and he's been campaigning on this since I started looking into it, then it would dwarf Rotherham. So maybe we'd learn more about how the cover-up happened if they told us about it. But so far, they are refusing to have themselves dragged in front of a court or a judge-led inquiry to explain what happened. We just don't know.
Charlie, Thank you so much for your time in this very, very, very busy week for you, this very busy day for you. We appreciate it. We appreciate your reporting.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and I'll speak to you soon.
Sounds good. If you're an American who was basically first exposed to this scandal in recent days, it's just incredible to read these reports. It's incredible to hear from people like Charlie who've been covering it for so long. I'm sure many Americans remember hearing about it back in 2014 and maybe even before that. But this recent wave of attention, just in the media and actually politically, as we think about the vote that happened in the last 24 hours, so much of that stems from Charlie's reporting. So to hear this from him, to hear some of his reporting about the survivors as the survivors have reacted in the last 24 hours, let alone the last couple of weeks, was absolutely a privilege. So I hope that you found it helpful. I know that I found it helpful. It's an incredible story. So we appreciate Charlie being here, appreciate Charlie taking the time, appreciate you. We appreciate everyone for subscribing here on the channel. It's so helpful. Thank you so much for subscribing wherever you download your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv to get full premium episodes of the show. We have one this week on Trump's flirting with actually acquiring Greenland. So a lot to talk about there, a lot to talk about here on the show in the days and weeks ahead. So we will be back here with more Undercurrents soon. Thank you so much for tuning in.